Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to What the Hell is Water? I'm Reed Garcia, and today is Wednesday, February 2nd, 2022. And for those of you who have been following the show for a while, you will know that today is officially Hump Day, which is a very important day for lots of reasons, and I'll drink to that. Yes, coffee is nice, especially when it's hot and it's fresh and it hasn't been sitting on the windowsill for 10 minutes as you've waited for the show, which happens sometimes. It's rough. I know you guys feel for me. Well, yesterday we had a lovely discussion with a certain someone, also known as Danielle, and we were talking about skilled hobbies. And when it comes to hobbies, the first thing we did was we defined what even is a hobby. And I was like, I don't know if I've strictly thought of that before or tried to define that. But basically it was what people like to do in their free time for pleasure. The official definition was leisure, their leisure time. And we added the addition of the word they're skilled because we were talking about some of the benefits of, all right, you're doing something in your spare time, something that you only can choose to do. No one's forcing you to do it. It's not a job, but it's something that you're doing in your free time. So you're choosing to do it. You're intentionally doing it. We're like, well, all right, well, if you're going to be doing that already, if you decide to make that a skilled hobby, it has some benefits to it. And some of those benefits are you can see measurable improvement. You can get plugged into a community of people who are also doing that same hobby, whether it be on something as simple as a subreddit or something in real life and anything in between. You can find people who are doing the same type of things that you are that are interested in those things. And a lot of times those can turn into kind of passions that you can share with people. Another thing that we mentioned was how, the cool thing about hobbies is they cut across all socioeconomic lines and all, job ladders. It doesn't matter who you are or what you are, at the end of the day, like if you're a person who likes to play basketball or if you're a person who likes photography, like you're going to be amongst people who like that type of thing. And I use an example of when I was playing basketball in a league at work, and I was like, all right, it didn't matter. Like there's the janitor right there. There's one of the executives. Like we're all here. We're all equal, if you will, on the court, and people were talking trash regardless of who it was they were talking to. So that obviously is a cool way to get to know more people. And of course, if you want to look at it from a selfish perspective, which is totally fine, by the way, using these hobbies as a way to network is a great thing to do as well. Danielle talked a little bit about her hobbies, which were mainly journaling and horseback riding, and of course, eating cheese. To call back to our Monday challenge, Danielle is a proficient cheese eater. She also shared with us about a book club she's been doing with her family. All of the women on one side of her family, they decided to do that about a year or so ago, maybe a couple years now. I can't remember, but it's been great because they do that once a month now, and now they're talking and interacting regularly, and sometimes they kind of talk about the book a little bit more. Sometimes they talk a little bit more about just what's going on in life. But regardless, it's gotten them together. It's gotten them talking. It's gotten them spending time together, which is something before that, maybe, of course, they did that whenever they saw each other in person, but they weren't really corresponding remotely as much, So this is a nice way to have a forcing function that gets everyone in the same room, which I mentioned yesterday, I believe, and I'll make sure to mention today. With men, this is especially a good thing. Like, hey, a lot of times a guy needs an activity to have as an anchor. If you just call up a guy and say, hey, I just want to chat. Certainly there are some guys who would be like, yes, especially if you're a hot girl, they might be like, oh, okay, I guess. But there are plenty of guys who would not, and they would just roll their eyes at that. So having an activity that you can anchor to is very valuable. I talked about my hobbies, my main hobbies right now, which are disc golf and Rocket League, and talked about how it's so great that you can play those sports and you can see measurable improvement but you can also just relax and have a good time with friends. And so I talked about how that's one of the things with skilled hobbies is kind of like a chart. Like maybe some days you're like, oh, I'm going to grind. I'm going to do this. I'm going to work really hard to either get to a new rank or learn a new way to throw the disc, or a new, in Rocket League, a new way to touch the ball. Well, so then you're like, all right, I'm improving. Well, eventually you're going to kind of plateau and be like, all right, I'm done with improving for now. Like, let's just chill. Let's just hang out. And I can tell you from my Rocket League rank, you can see, especially on the nights and the late nights and the weekends, that's when that skill level starts to just kind of go down, but that's okay because I'm having a good time. I'm spending time with my buddies. And of course I couldn't miss giving it another shout out. I referenced the game Game that I played years and years and years ago. That was an online game, and it's a text-based only game, which I never thought I would play, but it was fun and it took me back. So with that, let's go ahead and jump over to our intro, and then we'll get ready for today's episode. Helpful for life. Welcome back, everyone. This is What the Hell is Water? It is episode 84. I'm Reed Garcia, founder and CEO of Helpful for Life, and we're about to be joined by a guest, a repeat guest, one of our favorites. Her name is Alexandra Mannerings, and she has a company called Merakinos. And you're like, what the heck did he just say? Well, I'm right there with you because she made up the word, which we talked about on a previous episode. We'll link that one in the chat. I think it was our first one that we had on. And actually, we have a whole playlist of Alexandra Mannerings, all of her appearances. So she gets the gold star for most appearances so far. And every time she comes on, she adds something valuable to us. And today, she's adding something extremely valuable to us, and that is science, the power of science. And, Alexandra is waiting in the wings, so she doesn't even know that I called this episode Science. What TF is it anyways, or something like that. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how does a scientific process work? What does peer-reviewed even mean? How are these people doing this science and getting it all wrong? And, of course, if you guys are like, I don't care about science, I don't bother. Well, guess what? It's affecting you whether you care about it or not. And that's probably never been more obvious than with this whole COVID thing. So I guess we'll throw that question in there too. Why did it take so long for a COVID vaccine to get out there? So let's go ahead and jump over to our guest. We've got Alexandra Mannerings of Merakinos here. Here we go. Good morning.
Hello. And I have an extra co-host today. This is
I
Nikita.
like it. So, what a cutie.
She, of course, hides under my desk until a call starts and then jumps on my lap. So
nice. Well, I was listening to a podcast the other day and they're like, oh, what's that on your head? And like, oh yeah, that's my cat. So at least she's not on your head.
Well, she likes to sleep across my shoulders, but I did draw the line on that.
Oh, okay, good. That's good. Well, hey, so good morning. Good to see you again. So when it comes to science, and like what all these things are going on, like where do you even want to start? Where do you think the lay person should start when it comes to science?
For me, one of the biggest things that scientists miss as well as the layperson is that there is a difference between a scientist and science. And I feel like this is also the difference between like understanding like what our Constitution says and sometimes how America acts, right? There's an ideal, there is a process that is the scientific method. Right? And you can imagine it in like neon flashing lights, the scientific method. And then there's like how scientists conduct themselves. And as scientists, we strive to uphold the ideals of science and to follow the methodology of the scientific method. Sometimes unintentionally, we fall short. And sometimes very intentionally, people will do nefarious things. And so what I'd like today to be able to do is understand like what is that ideal scientific method? How does the scientific community work to advance new and better ideas, refined ideas, improved ideas, and then sometimes how we mess it up? Because I think that that's really important to understand as well, so that, as someone from the outside watching, one, you don't lose faith in the whole system because someone makes a mistake. But then also you can be a more discerning consumer of what comes out of the scientific institutions.
Yeah. And I'd say one of the biggest lessons for me after I graduated college and got into the quote unquote real world and started to do some businessy things was I was like, uh, before I'd done this, I'd always been like, well, why do they do it this way? And man, that seems really dumb. And clearly something's wrong here. Why are they doing that? And then I got into business and I was like, oh yeah, it's just a bunch of people. And it's like, it doesn't matter how smart they are or how amazing they are. All the time here we talk about how we all revert to we have our caveman meat sacks that we carry around everywhere. And sure, maybe scientists are smarter than the average person, which maybe not always be true, by the way. But yeah, they're still humans. They still make mistakes. And that's actually the exact reason this whole scientific method, this whole scientific process exists. So whenever you're questioning anything at home, like, why is this a thing? Be like, oh, that was probably just some person making a silly mistake, Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes the scientific method so powerful and the community of scientists so powerful is that it's self-correcting. So you can have a business, right, make some really bad decisions and it will keep making bad decisions.
Right.
Because it may not have any kind of infrastructure or methodology for rescuing itself from its bad decisions. And that's why I argue having data as one of your core tenets of an organization is important, because it can be one of those self-rescuing things.
Yeah, and this popped in my head, so I got to share it. For those who are 90s or earlier, you might remember a company called Blockbuster. And this is they had Redbox come in, and they had Netflix come in, and they failed to pivot, and now they're no longer here. So that's one example of failing to pivot in business can lead to issues.
Yeah, and whereas with science, right, sometimes we get things wrong, or sometimes we find something out that is true based on the information we have at the time, and then we get better information and we improve on it. And like I said, there's always human personalities that get in the way. And sometimes, the more of an expert you become in a field, the less open you are to new information. And then you sort of lose your status as a scientist and become a dogmatist, if that's a word.
Yeah.
So, but just to back up, like, let's talk about what the scientific method is and why it's different than, say, like intuitively trying to answer a question or, answering a question through consensus. And consensus is a big word that gets thrown around a lot. So the scientific method follows the same formula regardless of how big a question you're trying to answer. So the first thing is that you start with some kind of question or problem. So this can be, I need to figure out like where Earth fits in the universe. Like, it could be a huge question like
That's
that.
a big problem, yeah.
A big problem. Or it can be, a very, very small one. There's a great one of, why do some rabbits' ears stick up and some rabbits' ears fall down? Like, what's the mechanism behind that? So they can be very important questions. But you start with some kind of question or some kind of challenge that you're stuck on. And then what you usually do is that you look and you say what already exists out there. So this can be called a literature review. If you're going to go and read all of the publications that already exist that might have something to do with your topic. It could be talking to experts in the field. Like, you're going to just figure out what already exists. There may be zero out there, or there might be a really rich body of existing information about it. And the reason you do that is because the next step is to take an educated guess. And we call it an educated guess because you're not just like pulling it out of the air. You're trying to base it on any information that's already out there to be more efficient in how you're going to solve this. So you're going to take this educated guess. Then once you've made that educated guess, right? Like, I think rabbits' ears fall down because they're missing a protein in their ear structure. So you
That's
make
a very,
that guess.
very educated guess. Good.
Right?
I've never had that thought before.
or I think the rabbits' ears fall down because they ate too many carrots. Whatever it is, you would make that guess. And
I think they ate too much broccoli. I hear there's a lot of protein in broccoli.
and you'll notice that guess is testable. So this is a critical element about the scientific method, which not only are you first like taking that guess, but you're taking a guess that you can run an experiment to try to disprove. So there are two critical elements here. One, it's testable. And two, you're going to set up some kind of test, right? Because it's testable, that is going to try to disprove yourself. So the scientific method works much more on disproving wrong ideas than proving right ideas. And there's two reasons for that. One is it's actually much easier to conclusively disprove something, right, than it is to prove it. And then the other reason is because when you set out to disprove yourself, you're also making sure that you're not succumbing to your biases as much, right? So you're going to pick a guess that you strongly suspect is true. And so you want to then try to disprove yourself so that you don't fall for the trap of being like, I'm just going to find all the evidence that does suggest I'm right, and I'm going to ignore or miss all of this stuff that says that I might actually be wrong.
Which seems like what most people do these days, non-scientists at least, right?
Oh yeah. Oh, it's called confirmation bias. It's baked into who we are and how our brains operate. So that's why we have a structure to help us try to overcome that bias.
Yes, and we've talked about confirmation bias on this show at least one time before, if not multiple. So we'll include a link to the episode where we talked about that. So did you say the word hypothesis yet?
Yeah, well, maybe not, because I just said a question that you can test. So the fancy word for this is a hypothesis. It's not a theory. In science, a theory is a very different thing from a hypothesis. So here we're talking about a hypothesis, which is a testable question, right? And I know I call it a question, but I phrase it as a statement, right? So like I have this question, why do rabbits' ears fall down? And then I'm going to make a statement that I can test, right? I'm going to see if my statement is true or not. And that's the hypothesis.
Gotcha. So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna ask, I've heard this word null hypothesis, or this term null hypothesis. What does that mean?
So that comes up when you are trying to compare the difference between two things, right? Like you're going to use a comparison to find out whether or not your hypothesis is right. So in our example, if we think it's because rabbits are eating so many carrots it makes their ears fall down, our null hypothesis would be then that eating carrots has no impact. And our positive hypothesis, or the testable hypothesis, is that eating carrots makes their ears fall down.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like, is it like the flip side of the same thing, just stated a different way?
It's not quite the flip side. Null means no effect.
Okay.
Right? So it's basically saying there's no difference between your comparison populations, or that the thing you think is driving this actually has no effect.
Gotcha. Thanks for sharing.
And this is where it goes back to like trying to disprove yourself. What you can do is, in order to say that you have any evidence in support of your hypothesis, you have to basically disprove the null hypothesis. So in order for me to make the claim that carrots make rabbits' ears fall down, I would need to have strong evidence that disproves no effect. Okay. If that makes sense. Right? Yeah. You have to have evidence. And part of this is a statistical construct. So there's all of these statistical tests and equations that you can use that help you say, like, does my evidence actually say that this thing had an effect? And in order to test that, you have to have your null hypothesis, which you then run your stats on, and you compare it to your positive hypothesis.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have, this testable question, right? And yes. Before we even got to that testable question, or actually do we start with the question or we start with the research, I guess is the real question.
We started with a question or a problem, right? Like, okay. Why do rabbits' ears fall down, right? We see this weird observation, and in science, there's a great line that says, what moves science forward is not aha, but that's strange.
Say that again.
What moves science forward is not aha, but in fact, that's strange.
Oh, I like it. I've said that strange many times. Maybe it's just the people I'm hanging out with, but does that make me a scientist?
But the idea is when you were like, why is that thing that way? Or that wasn't what I expected to happen out of this. Or like that there's something that you're like, I don't understand this. And then once we've got our hypothesis where we've made our statement and we have our null hypothesis that we can try to disprove, then you set up an experiment or an observational study. And now I'm going to compress it like an entire body of experimental methods into like a very simple explanation. But there's sort of two general groups of ways that you can try to answer your question. If you have direct control over the thing, you can set up what's called an experiment. Meaning I'm going to take 10 rabbits that have ears that stand up, and I'm going to feed them a whole ton of carrots. And then I'm going to take 10 other rabbits that have ears that stand up, and I'm not going to feed them any carrots at all. And I'm going to watch what happens. So this is called a controlled experiment, right? Because I can control who gets the intervention, the thing that we're trying to test, and who doesn't. And I can see, like, okay, after time, do the rabbits with the standy up ears that get all of the carrots, do their ears fall down? Many times we have questions about things that we can't necessarily experiment directly on. So if I have a question of, like, why do some children, or, so the question about, does hearing more words for young children increase their vocabulary as they get older? It's harder for me to experiment on that because I can't lock 10 kids in 2 different rooms and, like, subject
unless you live
them
in
to,
like China or something like that.
Right. Well, there's a whole separate other problem. But I could do an observational study. So I could go and give 100 parents little word counters, and then I could track those children over time. And I could look at, okay, how many words did these children hear compared to their vocabulary by the time they're 5th grade, and how many words did these kids hear and what's their vocabulary? But because I'm not controlling the setup, right? I'm not controlling how many words each group is exposed to. That's considered observational. Or I can also do observational things by looking in the past, right? So if I want to look at, and a lot of this happened of, like, do cigarettes cause cancer? I'm not going to go and force a bunch of people to chain smoke cigarettes and then forbid a bunch of other people to smoke. But I could go back and look at 20 years of medical claims and look at people's records and say, okay, this group of people didn't smoke, this group of people did smoke. And, what proportion in each group developed cancer. So that's called a retrospective study, right? I'm looking back in time, and it's a kind of observational study that uses things that already happened. Rather than looking forward, which I did with my example for tracking the children, where we don't know the outcome yet. We're tracking them from the beginning, but we're not interfering necessarily with what happens to them.
Okay, so we've got that. We not the aha moment, but I wonder why that is moment. Yeah. So we start out with that, and then we're like, okay, I wonder if anyone's figured this out before. Which, by the way, I encourage everyone at home, do not skip that step. Because guess what? There are a lot of really smart people, and there have been a lot of really smart people, and they figured out a lot of stuff. It's been many times where I sit down, I'm trying to figure something out myself, and I'm like, wait a second, Reed, like, why are you sitting here doing this yourself for an hour? It's like, just go online, search the thing, just spend at least 5-10 minutes, just at least for like a quick search, and see, does anything even like sound like it exists in this? And so, don't skip that step, especially if you're a scientist. Then that needs to be much more than just 5-10 minutes, right? So you start with the question, then you do a little bit of research, see if it exists, and then you say, okay, now I've got what we call a hypothesis. Here is a question that we're going to test. And let's just use this bunny example. So go ahead and state the hypothesis for our bunny example.
Right. So we're going to hypothesize that eating too many carrots makes bunnies' ears fall down.
Okay, so we're going to hypothesize
That's why some bunnies ended up with floppy ears and some bunnies end up with little sticky ears.
Right. And so we say, okay, we've got this hypothesis that bunnies that eat too many carrots have their ears stand up. Is that what you said? Okay. Yes. So then that gets us to the experiment, right? And that's where we're going to do some sort of test or series of tests. And what exactly that test looks like can vary. So one of the things first that we wanted to point out was, hey, when you're doing a test, it's important that you have what's called a control group, which is, hey, we're not going to do anything to this group over here, just so we can see like what is, without taking any additional action or changes, this is something we can compare to. And then we have variables that we can change. And ideally, you're only changing one variable at a time, if possible. That way you can see, oh, I know definitively that it's because we gave them more carrots. You don't want to give some like baby carrots and some purple carrots and some red carrots and just mix it all up, because then you don't know exactly what the cause was. And so one of the things you were pointing out is Well, that's nice and neat and all, but it's not always going to be that easy to do just because of reality, especially when it comes to humans, because there are limitations as to what humans are willing to do. There's limitations as to even if you find people who are willing to do something and willing to maybe take money for something, you actually introduce some confounding variables. You're like, well, only certain people would do this type of thing, so therefore do we have a representative sample of the rest of the population? I don't know. And so you mentioned things like, for example, smoking, or another thing which I'm not sure you mentioned, but I'll mention is anything to do with the diet or exercise or something like that. Those are hard things to isolate a single variable, and that's what makes research in those areas so difficult. So we've got the thought, we had the research, we have the question, now we have the experiment. Then what?
Or the study. And you mentioned a control group, and this is again where like your null hypothesis comes in. In some ways you can think about your control group, whether or not you're doing an observational study or an actual true experiment, you want to find a group that represents that null hypothesis, right? Because to your point, like let's say I look at my group that has the carrots, that eats all the carrots, and all their ears fall down. And I'm like, see, carrots make their ears fall down. But if I then look at the group that didn't have any carrots and all their ears fell down too, it's not because of the carrots. And this is a step that a lot of people miss, right? And this is, again, goes back to confirmation bias. Like, we want to look for something. So like all of the studies that are like, we looked at the top 10 most successful companies and we found these 10 traits in common. You're like, well, do all 10 of those traits also exist in unsuccessful companies? Like, unless you can show me that they don't, I'm utterly unconvinced by the fact that they happen to exist in all 10 of the successful companies. Maybe that's just it's just common in that in companies generally, right? And this is again true of so many things, that you could just be picking up something that's common in the population or something that was going to happen anyway. So we're going to test our null hypothesis and our positive hypothesis.
I just want to point out real quick, sorry to interrupt, was, and that kind of makes me think of the term correlation versus causation, right? Where it's like, oh, hey, this thing just happens to happen versus this is definitively why that happened. We talked about that on a previous episode as well. And one of the favorite ones, I think was actually from one of our commenters, was like, hey, and I may mess it up, but I think it was the correlation between the number of ice cream cones eaten and the number of drownings. It's like, no, those things just both go up in the summer because people are at pools.
Yeah. There's a good one about ice cream sales and murders.
Yeah, nice.
Because again, they're both driven by another variable. And that's something that scientists have to deal with all the time, and a controlled experiment helps mitigate that. It reduces the chances of that happening. It's much more common in observational studies. Then you're going to make some conclusion about your findings. And usually, like when you publish a paper, and we'll get to that in a sec, you'll make conclusions that are strictly supported by your evidence. So you will say, and this is where scientists get famous for not, like Fauci, not wanting to ever say anything with like certainty, is you'll say evidence is strongly suggests that, and then you'll summarize your findings. So if in our experiment, the rabbits that ate the carrots, 8 out of 10 of their ears fell down, and in the group that didn't eat carrots, none of their ears fell down, we would say the evidence strongly suggests that carrot eating is related to having floppy ears. And then you're also allowed, like in the end of your study, to speculate a little bit bigger about like what bigger implications that finding might have, or where you'd like to see more research. Like, what are the limitations of the study, and what do people need to consider? Like, let's say you tested this all on dwarf rabbits. You can say our evidence stands up for dwarf rabbits, but full-size rabbits may respond to carrots differently, and this is a limitation of the study. And I like to point this out because scientists will talk about this, and then when a press release gets a hold of the study, they won't report, study shows that dwarf rabbits may be influenced by carrots. They'll be like, carrots make bunnies' ears fall down.
Right.
So I like to point out that scientists are doing that. They're saying, hey, look, there's limitations on the study. We have to be careful about how we generalize, right? Like, how do we apply the findings of this one study to the whole population of millions of rabbits and different breeds and everything like that. And oftentimes the media will miss those caveats or warnings about that. But then, so then you've done this whole thing. You've decided what your conclusions are. You've run some statistical tests to either disprove your null hypothesis or support your true hypothesis. And then you're going to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. So you're going to write up everything you did from your background research, right? Your literature review that you did. You're going to write all of that up. You're going to describe the methods that you used in your study or experiment. You're going to present the data of your findings. You're going to say what you think it means. And then you're going to go to a journal and you're going to say, here's this really cool thing I did. Do you agree that it adds to the body of science? And an editor will usually say, oh, yes, this looks really interesting, or no, thank you. And if they say, yes, this looks interesting, it then goes to a group of peer reviewers. So these are going to be scientists that are picked from your field that usually have a strong expertise in this particular area. So preeminent bunny veterinarians or, logomorphists. I don't know, bunnies or logomorphs,
that's
whatever
a fancy
they call
word.
it,
I like
study
it.
of bunnies. Right? So it's going to go to like bunny specialists. And these people are not paid. They do it out of their generosity of commitment to science, right?
Science.
And so they're going to be usually academic. And these reviewers will read your paper and they will give feedback saying, I'm a little concerned about the fact that you didn't control for the type of carrot that you gave your experimental group. That makes me suspicious that these findings are not robust enough. Or they might say, I don't really like the statistical test that you used. Do you think you could rerun your data with this better test? Or they'll say, wow, this is really great. Love it. Like we think that you should definitely accept this. Or they'll send it back and say, please make these changes, or they'll reject it outright. And then once either you make the changes or they approve it, then it gets published into this journal. So once it's published into the journal, it's then considered sort of publicly available scientific knowledge. And people who get the journal, who follow that field, will read it, and they can write back to the editor with comments. So if someone looks at this and is like, oh my gosh, no, they've got this wrong because I just discovered blank or whatever, they can write to the editor and say, hang on, we gotta do this again. Or they might find out, they might do a new study. It might inspire a new study, right? Because we talked about reading the literature before you get started. So someone else might read this carrot study and go, I don't think it's actually the carrots. I think it's the fact that when rabbits get carrots, they drink more water. And it's actually the water that's driving their ears to fall down. And so they might do a subsequent test, right, to say, okay, I'm going to do another experiment and prove that it's not the carrots. It's actually more likely to be the water that they're drinking. And so what's great about this, right, is that not only do you have this very rigorous method to follow to make sure that you're actually providing good evidence to disprove your null hypothesis, or disprove your hypothesis. Sometimes you disprove your idea and you say it wasn't the carrots at all. But you also are publicly like crowdsourcing perceptions and opinions and thoughts on, is this accurate? Are there problems with how we've done this? Does someone else out there have any other questions or thoughts about this? And someone pointed out that like science really is fundamentally like a crowdsourced success story, because it's not just one scientist who's like, I'm going to do this. This is my thing. And what I say, that's the end all be all. It's that you have dozens or hundreds or thousands of scientists working on similar topics, sometimes disproving each other, sometimes bringing new evidence to light, sometimes getting into incredibly heated arguments about like, what does this piece of information actually mean? And that prevents like single personalities from dominating what counts as truth. Although, right, that still can happen. You still can have, eminent experts in a field that really squish new people coming in. And whenever you see that, that's where I get a little nervous. Like, for example, I loved how Fauci from the very beginning, was saying, look, we can't be certain about these things. He was so good about expressing the variability and randomness and uncertainty that was coming around COVID, which is so important from a scientific point of view. But I noticed that recently he's started taking on this role of like, I represent science. And if you disagree with me, you disagree with science. And I have a big problem with that, because the moment that you've then tied it to a personality, you're shutting down the ability to disagree on the merits of the information.
Yeah.
Right? Like, no. I can disagree with this idea and not mean it as a disrespect to you.
Right.
But he's merged his personality with the stances that he's taken before. And now we have a problem that we can't debate this or disprove it on a basis of evidence. It has to become this like personality conflict.
Which is a great example of why you can never have one person represent an entire institution,
Right.
an entire company, an
Yep.
entire race, an entire anything,
Yeah.
because it's
Mm-hmm.
never as simple as that one person. And as we started out this whole segment by talking about, people are humans and humans make mistakes. And, Fauci is a smart dude. He's done a lot of good things. But he might have made a pitfall here by doing that. And also some of that's probably falling to being a victim of the press, if you will, and the hubbub of it all, because people do get so heated about it. And honestly, I got to imagine how frustrating it is for Fauci. It's like, look, people, I'm trying to give you guys the information. I'm telling you the best thing that we know right now. Recognize it is going to change. And don't be mad at me in 6 months whenever we say, hey, masks maybe aren't as effective as we initially thought we were. 6 months ago, they were the best thing that we had based on the information we had. Now, maybe there's a little bit more information. And I just want to point out, I'm not making any statements about masks or factual things about that. Just pointing out, like, whatever we knew back then was different than what we know back right now. And that's the power of the scientific method, is you are always saying what the best thing is that you know right now, and recognizing it may change. So to recap here, we started out with hey, what is that? Why is that? That's interesting. I'm not really sure. Then you form your hypothesis and you say, okay, I think that carrots ears stick up whenever they eat too many carrots. I said carrots ears, but I meant rabbits.
Yeah,
if carrots had ears, then that would be interesting. So bunny ears are less floppy. They stay at attention whenever they have too many carrots. So then that's your hypothesis. Then you go and look. You do a little bit of research, see what's already been done, and you find some other results, and you say, hey, you know what? I don't think this has been definitively proven yet. So then you design an experiment, or as you pointed out, maybe sometimes you do a study, because that might be the better thing to do. And when it comes to experiments and studies, you're going to want to have the control group, where it's like, this is the quote unquote normal, where we're not going to touch them. And then you have the things where you vary a variable, you change a variable, and then you observe, you take in all of this data, and you do all of these experiments. And if you're doing it right, you're making sure to get a statistically significant amount of data from a representative sample of the population. And I'm using a bunch of words we're not going to describe today, but for those who are out there who want to know them,
yeah, we can do that next time.
Yeah. So you have that data, right? And then you write up your findings, and you say, hey, we found that, I forget, did we say in our imaginary example that carrots' ears do or don't stand up? What were our findings?
I think I said that carrots made their ears fall down.
Okay, so we actually found out that carrots make their ears fall down. And then we write and we say, okay, we actually just tested this on one certain type of rabbit, the dwarf rabbit. Okay, so then in our findings we say, hey, we noticed that they fall down. The data suggests, which if you ever read a scientific paper, you'll notice that they're very specific about their words, and those words matter. And one of the things Alexandra pointed out earlier was, hey, journalists, a lot of times, especially ones who don't regularly do scientific journalism, they mess up those words. They remove those words because they recognize, hey, I'm going to get more clicks. I'm going to get more people buying these papers. I'm going to get more people talking about this on the news. So they take that stuff out, which is a troublesome thing to have. Then you say in your data, in your report, you say, okay, this is what we found in dwarf. We speculate that maybe this might apply to other rabbits, but we don't have the data yet. And then you submit it to a journal, and the journal says, hey, maybe change this couple of things, or this thing's wrong, go fix that, which, by the way, that can be a process that takes months, sometimes years, and sometimes you have to go back to the experiment and do some different things. I had a friend who just went through that.
It's not the journal who says that. It's a group of peer-reviewing scientists.
Thank you.
So the journal will gatekeep whether they think it's appropriate for their journal, right? Oh, this topic doesn't apply to our journal, or we don't think that this significantly contributes to the body of literature, so, we're not interested in it. But then once they decide, yes, we would like to consider this, it's not the editor of the journal or the journal staff that's saying, please change this. It goes to a group of scientists, 3 to 5 scientists who are experts in that field, and they're going to read it and give back their feedback. And oftentimes that's blinded. So the author can't know who those experts are, so that there can't be any like, retribution because you disagree with somebody.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. So people peer review it. That process may take a little while. Then it goes to the journal, which then also may say you might need to change a couple of small things to make it in line with our journal. And then it's published, and then people read the journal, and then it goes to the wider audience where more people read it. And this is a thing scientists do. Instead of reading just the newspaper on Sunday, they'll go through these papers like for fun. I know some of you are like, why would they do that? Nerds, am I right? But then they write in and they say, hey, they missed this whole thing, or I have this other experiment, and that can change things as well. So that's a scientific method in a nutshell. So we'll end with the last question for you, Alexandra, which is, okay, scientific method, I got it. Maybe I'm not completely on board yet, but I understand it a little bit more. So what's up with the COVID vaccine? I hear they figured it out in a weekend. They ran the mRNA or whatever the heck that means, and they sequenced it using aliens or computers or something. And then they're like, all right, we've got this vaccine now. So why do we have to wait so long until we actually got it?
That's interesting, because from my point of view, I was incredibly skeptical when they're like, oh, we'll have a vaccine within a year. And I was like, that's never been done. BS, no way. And I ate my words, because like the fact that they turned it out that fast blew my mind, because there's so many elements of this. But one of the things is, so there's about 20 years of mRNA research already in progress, right? They didn't invent this technology overnight, which is one of the reasons why they could actually get to even something that was testable so quickly. They had the technology already in place. It had just never been used for an actually approved vaccine before. It had been tested a little bit on as a potential for an Ebola vaccine, and it had been tested on a small population, but it hadn't been used large scale at all. So then basically they create, right, as you said, they sequence the virus, and they are able to create this mRNA vaccine for a particular protein or particular part of the virus. But then they have to test it. So they have to prove two things. They have to prove that it is safe, and they have to prove that it's efficacious, meaning it does what you say it's going to do. So they took 35,000 people, and each of them about this. I think Pfizer was like 40 and Moderna was 35,000. And they gave those 35,000 people a shot of their vaccine. And then they tracked another group of people that didn't get the vaccine. And they said what proportion of people who got the vaccine ended up with COVID, and what proportion of people who didn't get the vaccine ended up with COVID. And they were able to show, okay, the group that got the vaccine was substantially less likely to develop symptoms of COVID or even positive tests for COVID than the group that didn't get the vaccine. And also here were all of the things that we saw go wrong with someone who got the vaccine, right? They got chills, they got arm pains, whatever, but we didn't notice any substantial increase in like serious risks within this population. So the number of people who died within the group that, the 35,000 who got it is the same number of people who like died in the general population of people who didn't get the vaccine. So we don't think it increases risk of death, etc. So you have to have time to do that. And then they tracked those people for 3 months to say, did anything additional develop? So you have to do all of those studies. And typically that process of proving safety and efficacy takes 10 years in order for the FDA to be convinced that like this is real. So this is why at the beginning, it was under what's called an FDA emergency authorization, was because they didn't actually meet the FDA's standards for approval because they were accelerating that timeline so quickly. And this is one of the things that made some people concerned, right? Like, hey, you've not followed the path we've traditionally taken when we send these things to like the market. But they did follow the same steps, just in like a really compressed timeline. Yeah. So I don't feel at all like, why did it take so long? For me, it's like, how the hell did they do that?
Exactly. And for those of you who've not heard from Alexandra before, her background is in infectious diseases. I guess you say it in your right terminology, but I guess my point is she knows what she's talking about. Well,
a little bit. I'm certainly not a COVID expert.
You're not a COVID expert, but someone who can decipher the papers and knows the terminologies and some of the things that can go wrong. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Alexandra. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. Oh man! So every time she comes on this show, there's so much we learn, and some of it's about the topic at hand, and some of it's about things that we didn't even think about. And I want to make sure to point out that Alexandra, her company, Merakinos, it's all about helping small businesses and nonprofits use data to help them achieve the things that they want to achieve. And one of the things that she says many times on our show is how you need to know where you're going. You need to know what you're trying to do. What's your North Star? What direction are you trying to head in? You need to know those things before you can help steer the ship in that direction. And so what she does with her company Merakinos is she consults with these companies, whether it's small business or nonprofit, and she says, okay, all right, now once you figure out where you're going to go, let's look at the data that we have, let's collect the information that we have, and then let's use that to help make the right decisions, to make the right changes, to help keep you going in that direction, or maybe you weren't going in that direction at all in the first place. So if you're a small business or a nonprofit, make sure to go check it out. Merakinos, Merakinos.com. We will include a link in the chat for that. And also check out her podcast. This is regardless of whether or not you're a small business or nonprofit. She has a podcast called Heart, Soul, and Data. So if any of this stuff interests you, data analytics, maybe some of the psychological confounding factors that come into play, but this concept of, knowing where you're going to go and then using the data to help you get there. And oh, by the way, she recognizes that not everyone's a data whiz, and not everyone's going to know how to use all the tools and all that kind of stuff. So that's what she does. She helps people learn what they need to know to get to where they want to go. So check that out. We'll drop links for that in the chat. Well, like I was saying, it was a wonderful conversation we had today with Alexandra, and talking about the scientific method. And I'm not going to recap it again right now because we just talked about it, but I am going to mention a couple of fun things that popped up in my head as we were talking, but I didn't want to distract too much from the conversation. The first one is a comic by a guy named Nathan Pyle, and he is one second, let me get the chat up here. He is an artist, and he has this world that he calls Strange Planet. And basically the whole concept of it is, if there were aliens that came to our world and they were to just act as if they were let me start that again. Aliens just kind of saying frankly what people are doing. And it's it's you are harvesting your animal's feces. Why are they doing that? Why are they saving it? And so just one example of he was talking about, people were just picking up poop as they take their dogs on a walk, but the way he words it makes it very funny, and it's that is kind of silly when you look at it that way. And so we actually ended up putting it on our thumbnail, part of one of his comics that is about science. And it says, "I have attempted science. Please explain," the other guy says. And there's a 4-panel here that shows that. And the last panel says, "I produced a detailed tribute to my wrongness." And then the guy says, "That is science." So I'll let you guys check out the full thing. Obviously, it's much better if you see all 4 panels and actually read the thing. Another thing that popped in my head was there's a comic called Dilbert as well. I guess comics are on the brain today. But in Dilbert, which is also a newspaper comic, but I guess at some point it was a show too. I wasn't aware. There's a thing called the Knack, and also known as the curse of the engineer. And since we're talking about science, we're talking about the scientific process. I had to mention that because I enjoyed that, especially as an engineer myself. The shtick of the comic is there's a mom and her son who's 5 or whatever, who's Dilbert as a kid, and they're in the doctor's office, and the doctor's like, "Ma'am, I'm afraid your son has the knack." And it's basically talking about how he's going to be a nerd. So I'll leave it at that and let you guys go watch the clip for that if you want to know a little bit more. One other thing that popped into my head was the Stanford Marshmallow experiment. I feel like it's a very popular experiment. It's been referenced many times and talked about in countless media things. But it's a good thing if you're how does the scientific process work? It could be a fun one that you might want to check out, because as Alexandra was talking about the studies you may do where it's you bring a kid in and you do this, that's what popped into my head, which was, okay, they put I'm not going to remember all the exact details, but basically they put a marshmallow on the table and said, "Hey, if you wait 15 minutes, we'll give you 2 marshmallows, or we'll give you some better reward. But you can always just eat the marshmallow right now. And so they did this test. They saw how the kids reacted. And then they're like, okay, well, what does that have to do with how, what type of person they are, how their brain works? Does that have any larger implications? Like if they have that self-control, will that have other implications? And so then they actually followed those people, and then looked at what happened with them, and they looked at things like the economic background. There's the topic of willpower, which is something that we've talked about on this show before as well. So it's an interesting study that some of you guys might want to check out. So I wanted to mention it. All right. So when it comes to science, one of the things that I wanted to mention today, that's right, peer-reviewed and science. It took me a second to connect the dots. I wanted to point out Kickstart Your Kitchen. So for those of you who aren't aware, Kickstart Your Kitchen is our first online course, and it's about teaching people how to cook. And a big part of that was, as we were creating it, was like, all right, it's very important for me and to me that this is science-backed, that I'm teaching things that are true and that are fact-based and research-based, and I'm not just spouting things that we heard elsewhere, right? Because I already knew it, but I became more and more surprised. I guess in some ways less and less surprised. There was a surprise curve. I was like, wow, that's not true. Wow, that's not true. Whoa. But that famous person, that chef said it, that surely they didn't know that, messed that part up. Like, they're very successful. They've done a lot of things. They've had a lot of restaurants. Like, surely that's not wrong. So I started to get more surprised. And then there was a point where I'm like, okay, I recognize there's all sorts of things wrong in here, taught by, of course, by your friends, your family, but then also by people on TV, by chefs that run restaurants, and actually people who teach cooking for a living. Now that I've been to a couple cooking classes myself, I'm like, they're just teaching things that are scientifically wrong. Now, the good news about this, the sort of saving grace of this all is, you can do a lot with cooking even despite being wrong. And you can use some of these things that, maybe that's scientifically wrong, but it still somehow happens to get you to the same place. So there's a lot of things like that. But the point being is that within Kickstart Your Kitchen, we did our research. We figured out, okay, hey, if you're looking at, for example, one of the myths that I've heard propagated many times is if you're looking at steak and you want to know how done it is, you can take your hand like this and you say, okay, if you pinch the pad of your thumb, and for those who are audio only, this might be one you want a visual for, but if you make like an OK symbol with your hand, and then you pinch where your thumb almost meets your wrist, the meaty part right there of your hand. If you're holding that, you pinch your first finger and feel it. You pinch your second finger and you feel it. Your third finger and your fourth finger. You'll feel that the how tight that muscle is shifts. And so the myth is like, by doing that, you can tell, this is rare, this is medium rare, this is well done. Now, one thing that is valuable about this is it does help you realize, like, hey, the more well done, the more cooked a piece of meat is, it can be a little tougher. It can be a little tighter. The muscles, fibers are tighter. That last part, honestly, I'm not sure if the muscle fibers are tighter, but it feels denser, if you will. When you poke it, it feels denser. Versus when it's raw, you poke it and it's very soft and supple a lot of times. And so by doing this finger, it does help you realize, like, okay, if this is rare and this is medium rare, I can feel it getting, harder to press. So that is one value of using that method. But the downside of it is there's just too many different types of meat. There's too many different types of cuts, too many different places that it's sourced from. There's just so many variables and different thicknesses of the steak, all these types of things, where that's not a good way to know. The better way to know is to use a probe thermometer. You stick a thermometer inside of the meat to the center, to whatever the thickest part, which is likely to be the coldest part, and you say, okay, what is the temperature at this point? Because I want to make sure that my minimum temperature at the coldest point is above this point. And so that was a big lesson for me. An engineer, a science dude, I'd never really used thermometers much. I'd always mostly gone by other things. Like I looked at sight, I looked at the meat, I could tell by the color, which, oh, by the way, color is not a great indicator either. Sometimes I'd poke it as well. Of course, there's always you can cut it inside and look at it. But again, even the color part is not a great way to test either, because again, there's a lot of these variables. Depends on how long the steak has been sitting out. And oh, by the way, also, you have to cut into your steak. So if you're doing that, maybe you're going to lose some of those precious, yummy juices. And then there's also the fact that color looks different in different lighting with different backgrounds and things like that. And color is perceived differently by people. So thermometers, if you do them right and they're good thermometers, they're not going to lie. They're going to say, this is the temperature you need. So the point of all that is to say this is just one example of how we incorporated science and research into our course, Kickstart Your Kitchen. And, we saw many a secondary source repeating and regurgitating the same information that was just wrong. We also saw this when we were creating our guide, Swipe Right, the credit card guide, which we'll include a link for that in the chat as well. And then with that, same kind of thing. You read on a bunch of these websites, some of them which were major publications. You're like, that actually, you're leaving out a really key part of information, or maybe that's actually just wrong. And so as we were doing the research for that, same kind of thing. We incorporated all of that, and we went to the primary source, which is the fancy way of saying we went to the people who first did the research, who first found out the thing, and we made sure to look for ourselves and say, okay, is that really what that meant? And there was actually a time with the credit card guide where I ended up calling up the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, or maybe it was the FTC. I don't know, those acronyms, I can't remember. But we called up the government entity that would best know this stuff about credit cards, and we checked with them. We said, hey, like I've been seeing this everywhere. I'm not really sure. And I asked the question, and they got back to me. I was like, hey, this is nice. Government got back to me, and they actually got back to me in a quick pace. Like within a couple days, I was like, wow, super impressed, and I was very happy. But anyways, with both of these things, Swipe Right, the credit card guide, and Kickstart Your Kitchen, we have created and published some work. And now we're at the stage where we're trying to get it out there. We're trying to market this. We're trying to get people to take this course. We're trying to get people to use this credit card guide, because at the end of the day, these things are meant to help you. They're meant to change your life. They're meant to save you money. They're meant to let you eat better. And when we were trying to figure out what we wanted to do first with Helpful for Life, it seemed like food and money were a good place to start, because regardless of who you are, regardless of where you're from, regardless of how poor you are, regardless of how rich you are, you got to deal with both of those things. And guess what? It doesn't matter how rich you are or how poor you are. I've seen people on both ends of the spectrum with a wide variety of financial knowledge. There's people I know who've made over $200,000 a year, but yet they're in more debt than people who make like 30 grand. And it's like, how does that happen? Well, it happens because they're not very well financially educated. So get into that Swipe Right credit card guide. We're going to be talking more about that. We'll have some additional teaching and maybe courses that use that to help walk you guys through that. But you can go right now, today, and have that entire guide for free. That probably will change in the future, by the way. So go to that link, put in your email. We'll email you the guide. And then you can learn, like, okay, what is credit? If I'm trying to maximize my credit card points, what do I do? How do I know when it's worth using points versus paying with money? How do I choose a credit card? How often should I get a new credit card? There's something called churning. Should I be doing that? There's so much in there, people, and it's all meant to help you guys. So please go through it. And with both Swipe Right and Kickstart Your Kitchen, we recognize we may have made mistakes. Right now, especially, I'm only a team of one. Although for those of you who are listening in a couple days, we just made our first hire, so that's exciting. That will help. But at the end of the day, between myself and, oh, by the way, with Kickstart Your Kitchen, I consulted with a food scientist as well on some of those things that were like, oh, not really sure about this one. What do you know about this? And so we publish these things, and now we've published it in our own journal, and we're ready to get it out to the world. And we want you guys to tell us, hey, this is wrong, or hey, you made a mistake here, or oh, maybe you could tweak that a little better, or maybe that wasn't as clear. And that's what we're all about. We're about tweaking that. We're about updating it and making sure that we're always giving you guys the best information possible. So check out kickstartyourkitchen.com and get our Swipe Right credit card guide. Swipe Right, the comprehensive guide to getting the most out of credit cards. You can get that from our website at helpfulforlife.com/swipe right credit card guide, with little dashes in between each of those words. And we'll, of course, include these links in the chat and in the description in the future. So with that, let's go ahead and jump to our... I wanted to mention, keep your ears peeled because next week is going to be a very exciting week. We are going to be doing a lot around cooking and a couple of other things as well. And it's going to be a week-long event, and it's going to be exciting. As we come up towards Valentine's Day, we recognize that is a great time for people to learn a little bit about cooking. And so we're going to be teaching some people how to learn how to cook to impress a date. And so if that interests you even remotely at all, then you should definitely tune in, because also recognize that the date does not have to be somebody else as well. There's something to be said about cooking for yourself and presenting it in a way where it's something you could be proud of, something you'd want to take a picture of, something you'd want to share with somebody. And sometimes it's nice to just share that with yourself and say, hey, you know what? I'm worth it. And I took the time and effort to make this thing, and now I'm going to sit here and enjoy it and savor it. And it just can completely change the way you look at food and think about food, and also think about yourself. Like, hey, you are worth it. You need to do a little bit of things to show appreciation to yourself. You need to celebrate some of the things that you've done, even if they're small, because I know that a lot of us can struggle with that, especially when there's a lot of crazy things going on in the world. So now let's jump over to our recap for the day. So today we had a lovely guest on with Alexandra, named Alexandra Mannerings. And those of you who haven't heard of her before, she's been on our show many a time. So make sure to check her out. We've dropped the playlist with all of her appearances in the chat. We'll go ahead and do that again right now. So you can start from the beginning and see, all right, what all has Alexandra taught us about? Because she has been amazing. She's taught us so much. Then we talked with her today, though. We talked about the scientific method. And we talked about the process of, okay, you start off with she pointed out, like, hey, it doesn't actually start as much with the aha. It starts more with the, why is that? Why is that? And then what you do is you say, okay, I'm wondering what this thing is. And in our case, we made a fictional example where we said, hey, if when rabbits eat a bunch of carrots, their ears are going to stand up. That was our hypothesis, which is a fancy way of saying our educated guess at the question's answer. So we said, okay, then we're like, all right, what has been done in this field already? What kind of research has been done? So you go and you look and you see, okay, people researched this, they said that, and then you decide, okay, maybe that's already been proven, or, oh, no, that hasn't been proven yet. So now I'm going to keep going, okay? So then you plan an experiment. Or if an experiment may not be the best, sometimes you do what's called a study, which is what you do when maybe you can't control as many things as you'd like to. But with an experiment, you have what's called the control group, and that's the group that you don't do anything to. We didn't mention it earlier, but another way of thinking about this, another popular scientific experiment is the placebo effect. And the control group, they give a pill that is just sugar. There's nothing in it. It's just a pill. It's just sugar, so it doesn't really have an effect. It's just a couple milligrams or whatever of sugar. It doesn't have any meaningful effect on the body. Then they gave the other people the medicine, and they said, okay, if we give these people the fake pill and these people the real pill, then they can look and see what effects actually happened. But the people have no idea which one is the real and which one is fake. And they may not even know that there is a real and a fake. And so by doing that, you can then observe and see what happens. You can collect the data from the experiment. And as we mentioned earlier, in an ideal experiment, you're doing that in a way where you're collecting lots of information and doing things that are explaining some terms like statistically significant amount, choosing a sample that sufficiently represents the entire population. And those are some terms we didn't dive into today, but we will talk more about those in the future. So, if you're here from the future, make sure to check your links to see the links below, see if that's here yet. And you have that data, you have that information, and then you analyze it all. And you look at the data and say, what does the data say? What does the data not say? And then you write up your findings in a report. And you say, okay, the data suggests, which is an important thing to recognize. A lot of times in these scientific papers, they're very specific about what words they use. And they're very careful about saying, hey, this definitively causes this. So no, based on what we know, based on this information, based on this data, it suggests that this thing may happen. Because at the end of the day, it's very hard to know something extremely definitively. And that's part of the reason the scientific method exists. It says, hey, based on the stuff we know right now, from everything before this, and maybe, or definitely from the data we collected, and maybe based on some stuff from before this, here's what we know. So they write that up in the report, and then another section within that report, they say, all right, this part is just kind of us speculating, us guessing, like now that we've done some stuff about this, let's try and say, okay, we think that if we applied this to something else or to a larger group of people, here are some of the things that we might expect happen. And again, very careful about that wording. I'm pointing out that they don't base that on the data. They're not saying these are the findings. They're just saying, hey, if we were to do additional studies based on what we know, we think this might happen. And in our little fictional example, we talked about, okay, the little tiny, maybe we just did those experiments on the dwarf rabbit. How would that apply or work with the larger population of rabbits or bunnies? I'd been saying bunnies and rabbits interchangeably, but honestly, I'm not sure if those are the same thing or they're related or what. So yeah, you wrote that report, then you submit it to a group of peers, a group of people who are also in the scientific field. They review it and they say, okay, this is good, this is bad, this needs to change, oh, you're way off or whatnot. And you go back and forth with them, you make some changes to your paper, maybe even have them go back to redo some of your experiment. And then after you've done that a few times and the peer group says, okay, you're good, let's move forward, then you submit that paper to a journal, and then that journal will publish your findings. And then that goes out to the larger audience and the more general scientific community. And when it gets to that point, that's where other scientists will review those papers, and they'll read them and they say, oh, that's interesting. Oh, nice. Yes. Oh, science. That's good. And then they'll be like, whoa, wait, what about that one part? They missed something completely. Or, oh, there was a wrong way that they chose the people they used for that. Or, oh, they didn't even consider this variable, or they didn't do that. And they will find and poke holes in it, and then they'll write into the journal, or they'll contact the experimenters and say, hey, look, what about all these things? And then sometimes that leads to significant changes. Sometimes that leads to additional studies and things like that. So that's the scientific method in a nutshell. And then we briefly talked about, why did the COVID vaccine take so long to get out? And first off, Alexandra pointed out, hey, 1 year is actually extremely fast. The normal process is 10 years. And she was like, as someone who's in the, not in COVID specifically field, but in the infectious diseases and has some background in that, she's like, I did not think it was going to happen. And they actually proved me wrong. And it was very interesting and very cool that they were able to get it done so quickly. And then she also mentioned a little bit about Fauci and some of the things about how he shifted the way he was talking over time, and some of the good things and some of the bad things about that. And then, excuse me. But yeah, so that was the end of the COVID talk for that one. So there's your recap for today. Thank you guys so much for joining us. However, we can't leave without a challenge. Don't you worry, I'm not going to forget. So let's see here. What should our challenge be? Something around the scientific method or science. I think here's I'll give you kind of two options. One's like super light, fun, and easy. The other one is a little deeper if you want to go that route. So the light, fun, and easy one is design a little experiment of your own. Don't worry about it being scientifically right, statistically significant, any of those types of things. But why don't you design a little science experiment just for fun? And it could be something, big. It could be something small. It could be anything. And if you've got friends or kids or anything that you want to bring in to use this as a fun little thing, I'm sure there are a lot of examples online you guys can find. But it made me think of one of my science fairs, or someone in my family's science fair experiment back when I was a kid. And I think it had to do with the amount of acid in orange juice. And it was like, hey, when you have no pulp versus full pulp, does that affect how much acid there is in these various orange juices? And it's like, I don't remember what the hypothesis was, but maybe you'd make the hypothesis and say, the more pulp there is in orange juice, the more acidic it is. And then you go and you buy these various types of orange juice, and then you test it. And you can get little pH strips to test the pH, which tells you how acidic it is. And then, of course, you can drink them all. And if you're like me, then maybe you'll want to turn it into a mimosa and you add some champagne or a lot of champagne with just a splash of orange juice. Or you can make what's called a manmosa, which is where you get a beer. You have the beer and then you add a little bit of orange juice. And my pro advice is start out with less orange juice than you need because it actually adds a lot of flavor. And then you can always add more. So there's a fun little one challenge. Go design a little experiment. Let us know what you guys did. Let us know what you find out, and we'll quote unquote peer review it for you. The other one that's a little bit different. Maybe some people it requires less physical work out of you, maybe, but maybe less interesting to some of you, and that is to go look into some science. Go read a paper. It's whatever it may be. Maybe just figure out something that you're interested in. Maybe you're interested in something in psychology. Maybe it's something COVID related. Maybe it's something to do with, growing tall or penis size, whatever it may be. Pick a topic and go look into the science of it and just go read a paper. And, if you're like slogging through and it's really long and really dense or whatever, like, okay, don't worry about it. Just kind of skim through, see if you can get the thing. Make sure you read what their hypothesis is at the front. Maybe kind of skim through the main body of the text, look at the pretty pictures if they have any, read the conclusion, read their suggestions for the larger, I forget the fancy term for it, but where we're talking about, they say, hey, if we did something else, here's what we do, here's what we think. Look at that part too. And then you can also go and look and see what journal was that published in? And you could go see what it looks like within, they used to always be, physical printed papers. Now there's a lot more that are just digital. But go look at that. Go look at the journal and see where is it, what other stuff's in there. You can always just look through the table of contents or browse through. So there's your 2 challenges for today. Design an experiment of your own and do it, or go read in some papers, some scientific papers, or do both. Let us know what you guys do. And with that, everyone have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.